Hey, Cookies here. This one's a little bit overdue, so let's go ahead and talk about Resto Shaman in Raid in 9.2. So starting off with the talents, we're going to talk about the first row, which is basically Unleash Life versus Torrent. That's the only two you'll really pick from. And then the way that you pick between them is Torrent is going to be a solid HPS increase just overall. It's passive. You don't have to think about it. And then Unleash Life, on the other hand, will give you more healing output in general, and also, more importantly, give you healing where it really matters because you get to choose where its benefit comes into play. Um, so if you are good about pressing this on cooldown and also using it effectively, then it is an amazing talent to take, and you should take it with no questions asked on pretty much every single fight. And otherwise, you should take Torrent if you want a little bit easier of a time, like easing your way into this playstyle, or if you want to focus on other elements of your gameplay first, then I would definitely recommend just taking Torrent and not adding Unleash Life to your list of things to keep track of when raid healing. Next up, the talent row is pretty much only the last one that we're going to talk about. All the others are pretty static, as you can see here. So we will talk about the last row, which all three talents are very, very competitive options and all very good depending on the situation. You have Wellspring, you have High Tide, and you also have Ascendance. So Wellspring has been the typical default choice for a long time now because Chain Heal hasn't really been a part of our rotation until now because of the 4-piece bonus and the tier set that we have in 9.2, which is why we start seeing High Tide popping up in a lot of these mythic logs, is because the 4-piece is making High Tide like valuable and Chain Heal a button that is actually worth pressing. So I would typically just default to Wellspring, and then again, as you kind of ease into the playstyle and understand how to use Chain Heal really effectively, especially if you're taking Unleashed Life, that's where this really matches in together, is taking High Tide while you have Unleashed Life, because it's another way to benefit from it. But I would take Wellspring by default and then kind of ease your way into High Tide and maybe see if you enjoy the playstyle. And then Ascendance is very situational in that you use it on fights where you need a lot of upfront healing in one small window of the fight. So an example of this would be something like Anduin when you have to go downstairs, or if you're upstairs healing a barrier, Ascendance can be used really effectively to heal a barrier, which I will try to remember to talk about once I get to the gameplay side of things. And then you also have fights like Prototype Pantheon, where Ascendance could technically be useful if you needed a little more seed healing or you need more raid healing during those like intense parts where you have no seed stacks and the phase has started and the raid's taking a lot of damage, and you need a healer to be able to really like pump HPS into the raid while the other healers focus on the seeds, stuff like that. That's where Ascendance can be very powerful. So that is talents. The next thing is Legendary and Covenant combo. Venthyr is overwhelmingly dominating as far as HPS goes, but all the Covenants are viable. You even start seeing some Night Fae as the raid progresses and on certain fights. The way that Night Fae will be useful over Venthyr is on fights where you can get your Healing Tide Totem to line up to 2-minute boss ability intervals rather than longer than that or things like that. So a good example of this is Lihivam. You'll see Night Fae Shamans, and that's because you get to line up your Healing Tide Totem with every single intermission of ads rather than every other intermission. Same thing with Lords of Dread. If you play Night Fae, you get to line up your Healing Tide Totem with every single phase where Mal'Ganis does the Dread Swarm, I believe it's called, where he does like a massive amount of AoE damage to the raid. You'll have Healing tied up for every single one of those, which is obviously very beneficial. And that's essentially where you would see this played. Halandris, another good example. You get Healing Tide for every Reclaim on Halandris if you play Night Fae. So it's a viable Covenant, but it doesn't mean you have to play one Covenant or the other on specific fights. Venthyr is like overall the best choice for every fight. Okay, so now Legendaries. So we have actually like 3 main Legendaries that are seeing play at the moment. We have the typical default choice, which is Primal Tidal Core. This is the one I would recommend to someone just coming into Resto Shaman. So this should be your first choice if you're like thinking of what to craft or what to do on your Resto Shaman. Just make Primal Tidal Core. It's a very simple Legendary. You never have to think about it. You never have to worry about anything to do with it. You literally just equip it and it does extra healing for you. And it's as simple as that. The next one is Deeply Rooted Elements, and this is going to give you random procs of Ascendance every time you press Riptide, so this is very good if you are good about upkeeping your spells, which we'll talk about in the gameplay section, and it can be good on specific fights where you can utilize those random bursts of Ascendance procs usefully. So the fights that I see this legendary being good on, at least in my eyes, is fights where the damage pattern on the raid is always the same. Like everyone's always taking damage in the raid throughout the entire encounter, and there's lots of just consistent sustained damage happening. So a good example of this, Artificer Zymox. The raid's always taking damage in that fight, whether it be through the intermissions, the tank bombs, the hyperlight spark novas. There's so many abilities that are rotating that the boss does that the raid will always be in a state where Ascendance could be useful if you get a random proc. Same thing with Prototype Pantheon. Everyone's always taking damage in P2 and P3, and it's a lot of damage. And then you also have Skolex. This fight, he does a like dot on the whole raid, so everyone's constantly taking dot damage. And then you see it less popularized as you see other fights where the damage patterns aren't quite the same, like Lihivum or Halandris and stuff like that. So, and then the last legendary before we talk about which one you pick is Jonat's Natural Focus. This is going to increase the healing done of your chain heal, and it stacks each time you use Healing Wave or Healing Surge. This should be very straightforward to explain. It's because of our tier bonus that this is obviously very, very strong, because our tier bonus is buffing our chain heal's crit chance and the healing done of chain heal, and then this increases the healing done even further. And then you have other things like if you take High Tide, you are now increasing it even further, making chain heal an absolutely massive, massive, massive heal to use every time you get, uptime on these benefits. Like you have 5 stacks of Jonats, you use chain heal. You have High Tide, you use chain heal. You have your legendary almost fully procced out, you press chain heal. And you have your totems dropping chain heal and all this. And I don't quite know the interaction of these legendaries and stuff with the tier set, like as far as if you drop a totem with your tier set, if it procs Jonat's Natural Focus. I would assume it would, because of the way that it just works in the past, like with just the tier set itself. So I would assume that these work on the tier set, and that's why it's also very good. Because you could, you technically don't have to cast chain heal, and these will still like just be constantly benefiting, because when you drop your totems, it will cast chain heal for you, essentially. Okay, so let's see. I guess before I forget, I'd like to talk about how to play with Unleashed Life, and that is going to be, you want to be using Unleashed Life on very powerful abilities. So that's typically going to be chain heal. So that's why you see a lot of these like High Tide, Jonat's Natural Focus, all of this really popularized and starting to be played more, is because Unleashed Life can benefit all of those substantially. So you're going to be pressing chain heal a lot, which we may not be used to if you've been playing Resto Shaman this entire expansion. Also, the most important ability to use with Unleashed Life is always the Venthyr Chain Harvest ability, because it does buff Chain Harvest, so you get a 35% increase healing done on Chain Harvest, which is absolutely huge. It can be a very, very massive heal every time you press that with Unleashed Life. Okay, so next we will talk about Soulbinds and Conduits. So for Soulbinds, Theotar is going to be your default choice because he's just the highest HPS Soulbind. And then Dreamweaver for Night Fae, I believe, though it's not too specific. And then the Conduits that matters, the only ones that I'm going to talk about is the Potencies, which you can have a mix really of any 4 of Swirling Currents, you have Nature's Focus, you have your Covenant Conduit, whatever Covenant you are, and then you also have Heavy Rainfall. So those 4 Potency Conduits are going to be the most important. I'll go over them one more time. And I'll list them kind of in, I would say, what is the most important to least important. So Swirling Currents, definitely the most important, like by far. You should always have Swirling Currents, no matter what. The next most important one would probably be your Covenant Conduit. And then you have, I would say, Nature's Focus and Heavy Rainfall are about tied. So those are, overall pretty even. You don't need to necessarily have either of them if you only run 2 Potency. Or, you pick which one you think benefits you more if you do have a 3rd Potency available to you. And then lastly, Trinkets. This is going to be very quick, as usual. Same as all healers, we just want stat sticks. Doesn't really matter. Elegy of the Eternals, Solea's Secret Technique, Unbound Changeling, the Alchemist Stone, Soul Editing Ruby, literally any trinket that gives you main stat and then gives you secondary stat on either a passive or active effect is going to always be the best options at the moment for Resto Shaman and Raid. All right, now we will move into the gameplay section. So I'm just going to kind of let this play out. It's just me on like a normal Holondrus pug, just kind of getting used to playing Resto Shaman. I do not have the tier set, so that's going to be the difference here. So don't pay too close attention to the gameplay. It's mostly just a background thing while I explain stuff, so you can kind of see as I explain things. So the first thing is the 4-piece. How is the 4-piece going to change your gameplay? So the 4-piece specifically will make it to where every time you drop a totem, it will also cast Chain Heal from it and consume any of the tier set stacks that you have accumulated from your 2-piece, which the 2-piece is every time you critically heal, it's going to increase the healing or the critical strike chance of your next chain heal by X%, and it stacks up to 50 times. So you should track that. By the time it gets to 50, which it never will if you're playing the class properly, you will need to press chain heal, but most of the time you just don't have to think about the tier set very much because it's naturally eating it, like the procs up itself. By every time you press Cloudburst, you're getting a chain heal. Every time you press Healing Tide, you're getting a chain heal, so on and so forth. So the 4-piece itself does not change gameplay very much at all. You really don't have to think about it too much, except for the fact that you're getting more chain heals, and there are things that will interact with that, like we talked about earlier with like High Tide and Jonat's Natural Focus. Next up, the most important thing for Shaman, just like with most healers, is some kind of spell upkeep. So the spells we're trying to upkeep as a Resto Shaman is going to be Healing Rain and Riptide. On a fight like Holondrus like this, you're not going to see me pressing Healing Rain very much. I do press it occasionally, but that's just when the melee are nice and stacked up somewhere and I can get some healing benefit off of it. But otherwise, Healing Rain on all other fights except Holondrus, you should have down, and you want it typically on as many players as possible. So usually that means putting it in melee, but sometimes there may be some raid groups where you need to put it in range because there's a bigger range stack than there is a melee. So fights like Skolex would be a good example where you have the range and melee split. You should just be dropping Healing Tide wherever the most players are. It doesn't necessarily matter where people are taking the most damage because you mostly are using Healing Rain to benefit your Cloudburst totem. And then the next ability that you really want to upkeep is Riptide. So we have Healing Rain and Riptide. Those are the two abilities that we need to be pressing a lot. So we want to be pressing Healing Rain as much as possible on as many people as possible. And you want to be pressing Riptide pretty much on cooldown on anybody in the raid. Every time you press Riptide or Chain Heal, you get a stack of, I believe it's called Tidal Waves. I'm sorry if I get things mixed up. It only stacks up to 2. You don't need to consume them every time. You can see here I'm at 2 stacks right now, and I'm still pressing Riptides. You really don't need to think too hard on consuming those stacks. Just use them when they benefit you most or when you have downtime to press the other abilities. It is a little more important when you get into Jonat's Natural Focus. That's where you want to be pressing them more. But otherwise, really just think about keeping Riptide on cooldown and keeping Healing Rain on cooldown, and that will benefit you a lot. Next up is Cloudburst Totem usage. So how do we use Cloudburst Totem? How do we benefit the most from it? Because it's a talent that we will always take right now because it's just so powerful. So the way that we should play around it is you really want to be thinking about Cloudburst as kind of like a ramping ability. So when the damage on the raid is about 10 to 13 seconds away, not too specific, like for instance on Holondrus, you'll see me dropping my Cloudburst Totem, like if I rewind back to the start and just let it start playing again, you'll notice that I drop my Cloudburst Totems typically when there is about 8 to 7 seconds left on the missiles bar here, and that is the main like raid damage that happens. And the reason I do it so late is because the boss has a really long cast time, and then the missiles drop on the floor, and then we take damage, and then we move, and then they explode, so on and so forth. So it's like a big buildup. So you need it to where the Cloudburst pops right after the raid takes damage. If it does it before, then it's going to do no healing. If it does it too late, then you're already going to either have people dead or you're going to do a lot of healing by yourself, and then the Cloudburst is going to overheal a bunch. It is, though, worth mentioning that it is better to be late on your Cloudburst Totem than it is to be early, because you can reactivate your Cloudburst Totem at any time after you drop it to just instantly make it explode and do healing. So if you're late, you can just drop the Cloudburst Totem late, and then just press it again when the damage happens, and you just don't have as much healing as you would have if you built it up a little bit more. But if you do it too early, then it's just going to explode on its own and just overheal everybody, and then the damage is going to happen to the raid. So hopefully that makes sense. And we'll get more into Cloudburst Totem as we go into the improvement section. So I would definitely skip forward ahead if you want to like understand more about Cloudburst and how to utilize it and what spells to cast and stuff like that when you're using Cloudburst. All right, so speaking of, we're going to jump right into that. So let's go ahead and talk about Cloudburst Totem usage and timing. So I'm just going to pick a random log here. We'll use, let's use, what's a good example of a boss to use? I think that the best boss would be probably Artificer Zymox. So let's go ahead and go to that. We'll just go to somebody using a Primal Tidal Core just for a good example. Since that will be our default legendary most of the time, we want them using Wellspring. And so yeah, we'll look at this log right here. All right, we're going to first do something where we check the boss. So we're going to go to damage taken. We're going to taken from ability over here on the right. And we're going to find Hyperlight Spark Nova. And we're going to find the, which one is this? That is not it. Which one? Glyph of Relocation. That is the tank bomb, I believe. There it is. Okay, so that's what we want to see. The Hyperlight Spark Nova isn't too important, I guess, because it's doing so much damage throughout the whole fight. So we'll just look at this like so. And then what we are going to do is go to cast up here at the top. We're going to go to friendly units. We're going to find the Resto Shaman we're looking at. And then we're going to find where we pressed Cloudburst Totem each time. And that's pretty much all we need to really look at. So what we need here is we want to, so if I just zoom into this, we'll see if it works. Perhaps it doesn't, but it should, especially with a good healing parse. So we zoom into this. So this is one of the Glyph of Relocations. So our goal should be to typically cast Cloudburst Totem about, I would say, like we said, 10 to 15 seconds before the damage actually hits the raid. So another thing that we kind of need to look at actually is I actually want to look at the boss's cast again real quick and see when the boss was using the Hyperlight Spark Nova. So instead of looking at damage done, we'll look at the cast, and then now we can go back to our Shaman friend and look at Cloudburst, because that might also be where we are lining up our Cloudburst totems. Let's go to this, and then we'll go to Cloudburst Totem. And then we will just zoom in to the second one that we were looking at. I'm going to go anyways, reset the zoom because it likes to bug out. Don't know why. All right, so there we go. And then we have the Hyperlight Spark Novas. Yep, so these are the Hyperlight Spark Novas. This is this. Cool. So we have this is actually a good example to use. So we have a Cloudburst Totem here that is cast at 218, right? And then we have the Glyph of Relocation does damage to the raid at 234, which means that if I'm doing math correctly, let's see if I am, just making sure. This would be 14. So yeah, I believe this would hit just as... Yeah, his Cloudburst was very close. I'm actually really curious on when the Cloudburst did healing. Chain Harvest, where is our Cloudburst? Yeah, okay, Cloudburst. Perfect. That is what I wanted to see. Where is it at? Cloudburst, we add that to the timeline. There we go, perfect. Cool, that will help us too. Okay. Sorry about that. Okay, so now what we're looking at is this Cloudburst Totem was just a tiny bit too early, because what happens is we heal the raid right before the Glyph of Relocation goes off, which technically it's not necessarily a bad thing, because maybe the raid was taking damage to a point to where we wanted to top them off before the explosion happened, which is totally reasonable. especially because usually the boss will sometimes cast a Hyperlight Spark Nova right before, or there's other things going on in the fight that make people take damage. But either way, what you're pretty much looking for is you want to make sure that Cloudburst is popping as the damage goes out. So ideally, the raid is already like stabilized and healthy going into this Glyph of Relocation. The Glyph of Relocation happens, it pops for damage, and then this Cloudburst pops. And the reason I'm saying that I don't think this Cloudburst was very good is because, as you can see, it only did 17,000 healing, which means that it was either it didn't have very many spells loaded into it, or it hit the raid and did a lot of overhealing. So that is, like we can see here, it did, let's see, where is Cloudburst? It did 33% overhealing. So yeah, it was definitely, the raid was pretty healthy, is what that is. And also the Cloudburst didn't have very much packed into it. So what we do is we just move this Cloudburst a little bit further ahead in the timeline. So like on Zymox, for instance, we have the Glyph of Relocation going out, and we want that to time, you want to cast Cloudburst, like I said, about 10 to 14 seconds before this damage happens, which means that we would cast Cloudburst somewhere around like right here, like 222 or 224-ish, and then let it go through, and then the Cloudburst would pop right here after the glyph happens. So hopefully, I know I just like rambled way too much, and I'm realizing that as I'm sitting here, but hopefully that gets you an idea of like the timeline of when you want to be pressing Cloudburst, because you want to be, and like why you need to be pressing it at a certain time before the ability happens, rather than casting it too early. If you have to, just press it super late, like up here, and then you can always just reactivate it or let it carry off into like these abilities here, like the Hyperlight Spark Nova and stuff. You can just use it to heal that. And then as you get more repetition and practice in, you'll learn the timings really, really well. Like I did a Halandris Pug, that one that's in this VOD, and this was like, we did like 3 pulls in this pug, and I already like started really understanding the rhythm of like where I should be pressing Cloudburst, where I should be holding it a little bit longer than usual, where I should like time it exactly so that it pops at the good moments when we have the missiles coming down, like stuff like that. Okay, so really that's all we're going to cover is Cloudburst Totem because of how important it is. So the other thing I will go over real quick before we're all done is the actual spells that you cast leading into Cloudburst Totem. And I do have an old video on this, but essentially what you want to do is the way that you should try to always manage. I'm actually wondering if I can find it in this log somewhere. Let's go ahead and zoom out of this and find other Cloudburst Totems. So the main way, if you're running Wellspring, to use Cloudburst Totem, I guess let me preface this with what's actually important. So Cloudburst Totem, it does not really matter what you press after you put down Cloudburst Totem. It's more about what you press before Cloudburst Totem, and that's just because you can like preload healing spells into Cloudburst. And what I mean by that is if you have things like Healing Rain down or Riptides on people, when you press Cloudburst Totem, those will be doing healing to people before you press Cloudburst. And now when you press Cloudburst, those will keep doing healing and feed into the Cloudburst Totem, even though you press them before the Cloudburst Totem. So like this, for instance, this is a good example that we just randomly zoomed into. This Healing Rain should have just been pressed right before the Cloudburst, because ideally the cast sequence is you drop Healing Rain and you use all of your Riptide charges and try to empty everything out in the tank, and then press Cloudburst, because then you get to cast more free spells like, Chain Heals or Healing Waves or Healing Surges or Unleashed Life and a Chain Harvest. Like you get to cast more powerful spells and more direct healing spells during your Cloudburst, rather than having to do this kind of upkeep stuff during your Cloudburst. Because if you have to do all these upkeep spells during your Cloudburst, it's not going to be a very big Cloudburst when it pops. You want to stack as much healing into it, and I'm not saying you should just like drop Cloudburst and like be spam chain healing or something to get as much possible healing into the Cloudburst as you can, because a lot of the time when you drop Cloudburst, you want it to just be passive healing. But the main point is like drop these healing spells before the Cloudburst so that you can do other things that are more valuable. You could even press damage abilities during Cloudburst now instead of having to do this stuff. So that's just the whole idea, is you should be just always have the mindset of drop Healing Rain and use up your Riptide charges and then press Cloudburst. So every time you're thinking about pressing Cloudburst, consider pressing Healing Rain and all your Riptide charges and then pressing it, which then again, you then have to start thinking even further ahead to like be able to prep that. And then one other small tip for like preloading Cloudburst is another spell is when you take Wellspring. I don't see it anywhere in this log so far. But what you can do with Wellspring is you can cast Wellspring and then drop your Cloudburst totem. And what it will do is the Wellspring will travel out from you and it will start healing everybody as you drop the Cloudburst totem, and again preload all that healing into the Cloudburst totem. So then you get to use Wellspring and not have it be inside the Cloudburst totem window and still benefit it. So it's almost like you're extending how long your Cloudburst totem is down because you're benefiting from healing spells that you didn't cast while in it. Like this right here, this Wellspring should be before the Cloudburst totem. This is where I wish I like recorded a log of my own and could go over like how I did cast sequences inside of or before Cloudburst totem. But again, I'm gonna really okay. Here's one. We got a Wellspring and a Cloudburst. Yay! So the thing I'm gonna really just like hone in on that I want everybody to take away from this is the spells that matter when you're casting Cloudburst is the spells that you press before, not after. Do not overthink what you're pressing during Cloudburst and don't think too hard on Cloudburst. The only thing that's important is dropping it at the correct time and using spells before to preload into it, which is just use up Healing Rain or use up Riptide charges, drop Healing Rain, press Wellspring if you have it, now press Cloudburst. So, sorry for rambling with this section. Hopefully I'll learn a little bit better how to explain it in the future, or maybe I can make another video kind of like really deep diving into Cloudburst so we can take up like more time to really like stretch out this talking space and talk about it more in depth, and I can really like go through specific examples with like a VOD and talk over it, and I can show like my own logs and stuff like that and show actual examples of it and why it's effective. So if you'd like to see something like that, just let me know in the comments and I will get to making that like within the next week or two. I'd be happy to do something like that because that sounds really fun, is doing like a really deep dive on just a specific ability or toolkit that a class has or something like that. So kind of like how I did the Kyrian ramp stuff, like that video for Disc Priest, I would do that with like Cloudburst Totem for Resto Shaman. So thank you so much for watching and have a good one.